42 years. That is how long Muammar Gaddafi held power over Libya. He survived every attempt to remove him. He ignored international sanctions. He defeated domestic coups and outlasted foreign invasions. By early 2011, he seemed untouchable. Why did his grip on the country finally slip? It wasn't a military strategy or a political shift. It was a total collapse of order. Everything changed in February 2011. Protests turned into an armed uprising. Major cities like Benghazi and Misrata became active battlegrounds. The sound of heavy machine gun fire replaced civil law. Gaddafi did not retreat. He mobilized his tanks and launched an assault on his own people. The footage shows burning military vehicles and smoke rising over Tripoli. The situation escalated quickly. NATO airstrikes began to target his armored columns. Gaddafi was forced out of his capital. He did not flee the country. Instead, he retreated to his hometown of Sirte. He hid in bunkers while the city crumbled under heavy shelling. But this was only the beginning of the end. There was no mistake. The circle was closing. Gaddafi moved from house to house to avoid detection. Food ran low. Electricity vanished. The former dictator was reduced to eating scraps and drinking muddy water. The end came on October 20th, 2011. It did not happen in a palace or a formal courtroom. A drone strike hit his convoy. Gaddafi crawled into a drainage pipe to hide from the advancing rebels. The camera records a dazed, bloodied man being pulled from the concrete tunnel. The crowd did not offer a trial. They offered violence. Within minutes, the longest-serving leader in the Arab world was dead on the pavement. The bodies were removed at night. Thus ended an era. 1942. Muammar Mohammed Abu Minyar al-Gaddafi was born in a desert tent near the town of Sirte. His family were poor Bedouins. They moved across the sand with livestock, far from the coastal cities. The young Gaddafi chose the military path. He graduated from the Benghazi Military Academy. He traveled to the United Kingdom for further training. He wore the uniform. He learned the tactics. But his mind was on the monarchy. September 1st, 1969. At just 27 years old, Gaddafi moved. He led a bloodless coup against King Idris. The king was out of the country for medical treatment. Gaddafi took the radio station. He took the palace. The monarchy ended in a single morning. How did he keep control? It seemed impossible for such a young officer. But Gaddafi moved fast. He dismantled the old system. He ordered the closure of United States and British military bases. He seized the oil wells. He nationalized the entire industry, putting billions of dollars directly under his command. Gaddafi wrote his own rules. He created a system called the Jamahiriya. He claimed it was a state governed by the masses. In reality, there were no elections. There were no rivals. He held every thread of power in his own hands. The footage from the 1970s and 80s shows a radical leader. Gaddafi funded armed groups across the globe. He sent money to insurgents. He sent weapons to revolutionaries. He became the primary enemy of the West. December 21st, 1988. Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland. 270 people died. Investigators traced the bomb back to Libyan intelligence agents. The world reacted. International sanctions hit Libya hard. The country became a pariah state. Gaddafi shifted his focus. He stopped looking north and started looking south. He called for a United States of Africa. He wore colorful robes decorated with the map of the continent. He wanted to be the king of kings. At first glance, a revolutionary. But in reality, a pragmatist. By the early 2000s, Gaddafi changed his strategy. He gave up his chemical and nuclear weapons programs. He paid billions in compensation for the Lockerbie bombing. He shook hands with Western leaders. He reopened the oil taps to Europe. But inside Libya, the air was heavy. The police were everywhere. Political parties remained illegal. Freedom of speech was a crime. If a citizen spoke out, they disappeared into the prison system. Corruption drained the national treasury. The oil wealth didn't reach the streets. It stayed with the elite. The Gaddafi family lived in massive palaces with gold-plated furniture and private jets. While the leader preached about the power of the people struggled to buy bread. Events accelerated. The tension reached a breaking point. There was no turning back. Thus began the final chapter of his rule. February 2011. Protests erupted across Libya. This was not a sudden accident. It was a reaction to decades of pressure. In Benghazi, the second-largest city, the atmosphere turned electric. Similar uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt had already forced their leaders to flee. This regional wave was the Arab Spring. Why did the Libyans finally snap? The spark was a single arrest. On February 15th, security forces detained human rights lawyer Fatih Turbel. He represented the families of those killed in the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre. In that single event, Gaddafi's forces had executed over 1,200 inmates. By midday, families of the victims gathered outside a police station. They demanded Turbel's release. The crowd grew. The sound of shouting filled the air. Tension turned into a movement. February 17th, the Day of Rage. Thousands of Libyans flooded the streets of Benghazi, Beta, Tobruk, and Derna. They were finished with dictatorship and poverty. But the regime did not negotiate. The footage shows the arrival of the Internal Security Agency. Revolutionary committees took positions on rooftops. They did not use tear gas or rubber bullets. They used live ammunition. Reports from local hospitals confirmed the carnage. Over 230 people died in 96 hours. Many victims were shot directly in the head or chest. Gaddafi did not retreat. He sent more troops. Snipers began picking off protesters from high-rise buildings. State media broadcasted a specific narrative. The uprising was the work of foreign agents and drugged teenagers. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi appeared on television. His face was stern. He warned of civil war. He promised that rivers of blood would flow if the streets did not clear. But the threats failed. The crackdown had the opposite effect. By late February, the military began to fracture. In Benghazi, the 36th Brigade received orders to fire on civilians. They refused. Major General Suleiman Mahmoud led his men to the side of the people. They helped rebels seize the city. The video evidence is clear. Government buildings were set on fire. Police stations were stripped, and protesters broke into armories. By February 24th, Gaddafi lost the east. Tobruk, Misrata, and Zawiya fell. Protesters were no longer unarmed. They carried rifles looted from abandoned military bases. Even the skies were not safe for the regime. 2 Air Force pilots were ordered to bomb Benghazi. Instead, they diverted their jets and landed in Malta to seek asylum. On February 27th, the opposition formed a leadership. They called it the National Transitional Council. Former Justice Minister Mustafa Abdul Jalil led the group. They declared themselves the official representatives of the revolution, but the country was split. Gaddafi maintained control of Tripoli and the western regions. He relied on elite units like the Khamis Brigade. This unit was led by his son, Khamis Gaddafi. They were equipped with heavy tanks and long-range artillery. The lines were drawn. There was no turning back. 3,000 foreign soldiers. That was the price Gaddafi paid to stay in power. The regime hired mercenaries from Chad, Mali, and Niger. These men arrived in transport planes and trucks. Their job was simple: silence the protests. Use any means necessary. By early March 2011, the situation shifted. It was no longer a riot. It was a war. Gaddafi deployed heavy weapons. T-72 tanks rolled into residential streets. Su-22 jets circled the skies. The military began retaking cities held by rebels. In the east, Benghazi and Ajdabiya faced constant bombardment. The footage shows the results: half-collapsed apartment buildings, craters in the middle of roads, burnt-out cars. International news networks broadcasted these images daily. Fear gripped the coalition leaders. One question remained: would Gaddafi massacre the entire population of Benghazi? At first glance, it was a local uprising. But in reality, it was a humanitarian disaster in the making. March 12, 2011. The Arab League met in an emergency session. They made a formal request: a no-fly zone over Libya. This was a tactical turning point. It provided regional legitimacy. Without this vote, Western intervention looked like imperialism. With it, it looked like a rescue. Events accelerated. France and the United Kingdom pressured the United Nations. They wanted a mandate for force. On March 17th, the UN Security Council convened. The vote was 10 in favor. 5 countries abstained. Russia and China refused to vote yes, but they did not use their veto. Resolution 1973 passed. The document was clear. It authorized all necessary measures to protect civilians. This meant bombs. It meant missiles. It banned all Libyan military flights. It demanded an immediate ceasefire. Gaddafi ignored the warning. There was no turning back. 48 hours later, the strikes began. March 19, 2011.
A coalition of the United States, France, Britain, Canada, and Italy launched the assault. The sound of jet engines filled the Mediterranean coast. The first targets were specific: radar stations, air defense batteries, command centers. The goal was to blind the Libyan military. Over 110 Tomahawk cruise missiles flew from American and British warships. They impacted with precision. In the frame, explosions light up the Tripoli skyline. French Rafale jets moved further south. They found Gaddafi's armored columns. The tanks were miles from Benghazi. The jets opened fire. The advance stopped. The mission had a name: Operation Odyssey Dawn. Its objective was the neutralization of Gaddafi's offensive capability. But the command structure was temporary. On March 23rd, the leadership changed. NATO took full control. They launched a new mission, Operation Unified Protector. 28 NATO nations joined the effort. Non-NATO partners provided logistics and bases. The sky over Libya belonged to the coalition. The siege of the rebels had ended. The siege of the regime had begun. March 19, 2011. The air campaign began. Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan joined the coalition. Within hours, the strike transformed Gaddafi's military infrastructure into wreckage. The targets were specific: MiG-23 fighter jets, Sukhoi bombers, and entire air bases were neutralized. NATO pilots did not stop there. They hunted long-range rocket launchers, supply convoys, and command centers from the air. In the first 14 days, dozens of tanks and armored vehicles were incinerated. This was most visible near Misrata and Zintan. Black smoke from burning diesel filled the horizon. At sea, the pressure was just as high. NATO warships established a total arms embargo. They patrolled the Libyan coastline, stopping and boarding any vessel suspected of carrying weapons. Gaddafi's supply lines from the Mediterranean were severed. The dictator refused to surrender. He appeared on state television frequently. In the footage, he is seen gesturing wildly, accusing NATO of a colonial invasion. He labeled the rebels rats and traitors. He promised to cleanse the country street by street. He claimed foreign powers wanted only one thing: Libyan oil. The regime tried to fight back. Soldiers fired Russian-made surface-to-air missiles at the jets circling above. They missed. The air raids continued without interruption. By mid-2011, the balance of power shifted. NATO strikes focused on weapons depots and command hubs. Gaddafi's forces were stretched thin. They lacked fuel, ammunition, and fresh troops. Rebel groups from the Western Mountains, the Misrata Front, and the East began a synchronized advance. They moved toward the capital from 3 different directions. August 20th, 2011. The rebels launched Operation Mermaid Dawn. This was the final assault on Tripoli. It was a calculated trap. Local fighters had been smuggled into the city weeks earlier. As armed convoys approached from the outskirts, these sleeper cells rose up from within the capital. Heavy clashes broke out. For 5 days, the city became a battlefield. The sound of heavy machine gun fire echoed through the neighborhoods of Tajura, Fashlam, and Souk al-Juma. Loyalist forces positioned snipers on rooftops. They rolled tanks into the streets. But the rebel advance was too fast to contain. The speed of the assault caused a collapse in morale. Hundreds of Gaddafi soldiers dropped their rifles and fled. Others raised their hands in surrender. August 23rd.
the rebels reached Bab al-Azizia. This was Gaddafi's central compound. It served as the heart of his power for 42 years. The site was a fortress. It featured reinforced concrete walls, hardened bunkers, and a network of underground tunnels. The rebels breached the gates. Inside, the scene was chaotic. They found luxury items, abandoned golden statues, and sensitive government documents scattered on the floor. Everything indicated a panicked evacuation, but the rooms were empty. Gaddafi was gone. By the time the perimeter fell, the dictator had already escaped into the desert. Intelligence reports confirmed he fled the city just before the final collapse. The capital had fallen. His 4-decade rule was over. August 19, 2011. The final hunt began. Gaddafi did not stay in one place. He moved between a network of safe houses, relying on local tribal leaders for protection. He changed locations every few hours. His family split up to increase their chances of survival. August 29th. His wife Safiya Farakash, his daughter Aisha, and 2 sons, Hannibal and Mohammed, reached the border. They crossed into Algeria. The Algerian government granted them temporary refuge. Another son, Saadi Gaddafi, headed south. He crossed the desert into Niger, where local authorities immediately detained him. Gaddafi refused to follow them. He stayed in Libya. He told his inner circle that leaving meant total defeat. He headed toward the Mediterranean coast. His destination was Sirte. Sirte sat 450 kilometers from Tripoli. It was 570 kilometers from Benghazi. This was his birthplace, but it was also his creation. The footage from that time shows a city of modern glass buildings, wide boulevards, and massive government complexes. Gaddafi had poured billions into these streets. He had hosted African Union summits in the city halls. He even lobbied to make Sirte the capital of the United States of Africa. Early September 2011. Gaddafi arrived in the city. The circle around him was shrinking. Only a few dozen people remained. These were personal bodyguards, high-ranking aides, and fighters from his own tribe, the Khadafa. They were the only ones he still trusted. His sons remained nearby. Muammar Gaddafi, a military commander, organized the local defense. Saif al-Islam, his political heir, moved between secret hideouts in the surrounding suburbs. Sirte was now the last holdout. The situation inside the city was deteriorating. National Transitional Council forces closed the roads. No supplies entered, no one left. Phone lines were cut. Satellite uplinks were jammed. The sound of distant artillery grew louder every day. Supplies of food and clean water were running low. Gaddafi lived in basements and abandoned villas, moving under the cover of darkness. He was cut off from the world, but he would not surrender. By the second week of September, the siege tightened. The rebel forces reached the outskirts. The battle for the final stronghold was about to begin. September 15, 2011. The final siege began. Units from the National Transitional Council moved in on Sirte from all directions. This wasn't a small militia. It was a massive force of thousands of fighters from Misrata, Benghazi, and Zintan. These brigades converged from the east and the west, tightening a ring around the city. The objective was clear: capture Muammar Gaddafi, end the war. The rebels expected the city to fall in days. They were wrong. Sirte became a fortress. Loyalist snipers took positions on rooftops. Artillery crews dug in behind reinforced walls. The defenders used schools, hospitals, and private homes as shields. Every street became a potential kill zone. How did the Loyalists hold out? At first glance, it was military discipline. But in reality, it was desperation. Landmines covered the main roads. Homemade bombs were buried in the sand. Any vehicle moving toward the center faced a wall of fire. The footage shows Grad rockets screaming into the city. Starting in mid-September, the NTC opened fire with everything they had: mortars, tank shells, heavy machine guns. The sound of constant explosions filled the air. NATO jets joined the assault. They targeted bunkers and command centers from the air. The city began to crumble. Inside the ruins, Gaddafi was running. He didn't stay in one place for more than a few hours. He moved between abandoned basements and cold underground bunkers. There were no more luxury palaces. There was no more satellite television. Only the smell of damp concrete and the sound of distant shelling. His command structure was gone. He communicated through handwritten notes and couriers. The soldiers were tired. Morale was non-existent. But Gaddafi kept demanding resistance. His son Mutassim took charge of the remaining fighters. He coordinated the defense, moving from house to house to keep the lines from breaking. By late September, the circle closed. The NTC held every road leading out of the city. No one could leave. No supplies could get in. The rebels began a slow advance. They cleared one block, then the next. Every corner turned resulted in a firefight. In the frame, black smoke rising over the Mediterranean coast. Progress was measured in meters. Hundreds died in the street battles. Above them, the sky was filled with the hum of engines. NATO drones and surveillance planes circled 24 hours a day. They were looking for any sign of a convoy or a satellite phone signal. The trap was set. There was no way out. Thermal imaging sensors and radio scanners. NATO jets used these tools to track every move from above. Because of this, Gaddafi issued a strict order: no phones, no radios, no electronic equipment of any kind. The group moved in total silence. They possessed a few satellite phones, but these remained switched off to avoid detection. Communication relied on human messengers. Runners moved through the ruins of Sirte on foot. They carried handwritten notes between secret hideouts. This was the only way to bypass the air surveillance. At first glance, a fortified city, but in reality, a trap without utilities. Engineers cut the power lines. The water pumps stopped. Gaddafi and his inner circle lived in darkness. They survived on canned goods and dry rations found in the rubble. Loyal civilians occasionally brought supplies, but most stores were looted or destroyed by shelling. It got worse. Medical supplies did not exist. There were no sterile bandages or surgical kits. The footage from those days shows doctors using basic tools to treat deep shrapnel wounds. Antibiotics ran out. The smell of infection filled the basements. Hunger and dehydration became the primary enemies. Men drank contaminated water. They grew weak from malnutrition. Disease spread through the cramped rooms of the remaining bunkers. The camera records 200 fighters still standing. These men formed the final line of defense. Most belonged to Gaddafi's own tribe. They were locals from Sirte and the surrounding desert villages. They didn't just stand guard. They formed a tight, desperate human shield around the colonel. There was no turning back. The circle was closing.